because right now, with the quantum effect of consciousness, and that you can't divorce the observation from what is being observed, which is really what it comes down to. There's no model that incorporates all of that. You know, there's not a unified field. As actually, I proposed consciousness as the unified field theory, because what unifies all the forces, the weak, strong nuclear forces, the electromagnetic force, and gravity, is consciousness in a way. I mean, it might be trite, but that's the one thing that underpins those four forces. So maybe consciousness, you know, given that E equals mc squared, is there some equation relating consciousness to energy, so that consciousness can be related to matter in much the way that Hindu mythology relates?
I think that would be I think that's the mistake that Western science tries to make, is to try and include consciousness in some way within the space-time matter-energy framework. And I think what all the great metaphysical traditions have said is that consciousness is primary to the universe, and that space-time matter-energy are part of the concepts that arise in consciousness.
Out of consciousness, right.
They're ways of explaining experience.
Isn't an epiphenomenon of matter, it's really
the other way around.
Right. So, you know how when Bishop Berkeley came up with his idealism and he was talking about the tree and the forest falling, which we're all familiar with, Bishop Butler came around and said, I refute him thus, and kicked a rock. It would seem to me that...
Johnson.
Was it?
Samuel Johnson.
Samuel Johnson.
It seems to me, though, that the similar thing for now is the refutation comes from just saying to someone, I refute you by my experience. I am conscious. I'm real. I'm alive. I'm having my whole interior realms of experience. I don't need to prove it to you. That's ridiculous.
I think part of the problem that we run into is that, first of all, it's not like science is monolithic. A lot of the time, I suspect that objectivity actually comes up as an issue more in what I would call scientism than science. I studied a lot with Noam Chomsky, and he used to claim that objectivity was not a goal of science, it was a tool of science. The goal of science is insight. We want to gain insight into phenomena. And something else that he used to say is that there are no, and Chomsky is pretty, straight rationalist, empirical rationalist, but he nevertheless used to say that there are no theory-independent facts. If you think about that, and if you put those two things together, then there is no objectivity, ultimate objectivity. But just going back to his remark about the objective of science is insight, if what we are after is insight, then we can investigate consciousness scientifically, if you like. But maybe it's not the science that, say, Steven Weinberg, who's rationalist, nihilist, reductionist, materialist, wants to have. It's not all going to come down to particles, obviously. But I think if we pursue the issue of insight as being the true goal of science, then in fact we can investigate consciousness scientifically.
I see it as the whole holographic universe theory of consciousness being like a beam of light. Like if this entire room were objective reality and the beam of light was one of those tiny lasers, no wonder none of us are able at all given times to experience the same thing through our five senses, because there's such a vast amount of phenomena happening, and each one of us has such a narrow little band of consciousness that's operating, especially in normal everyday consciousness, that, while there's a lot of overlap, which we call objectivity, there's a lot of non-overlap. So I can see why some people might say, well, there's no objectivity there.
Galen, in some of the conversations that you've been having with your friends around objectivity, it seems there was another issue involved, that you had a concern about if we let go of objectivity, then we're going to get ourselves into some real trouble. Everything becomes subjective, there are no standards.
Yeah, I've had people argue, that basically, since everybody clearly has their own subjective reality, everybody has their own reality tunnel, and they'll make the logical or illogical leap that, well, therefore, somebody like Adolf Hitler is no better or worse than Einstein. They were operating by their own belief system, and therefore, they're equally good or equally bad. I mean, to define, good and bad, that's another tricky thing. That's objectivity, subjectivity. And I argue against it. I come down maybe disagreeing with a lot of people on the panel that there is objectivity. As a matter of fact, and I'll invoke Hegel, that if you look at the dialectic, that subjectivity, objectivity are two poles in a Hegelian dialectic. You know, like good and bad, love and hate. That you can't, in a way, you can't have subjectivity without objectivity. You can't have objectivity without subjectivity. As a matter of fact, in an effort to integrate that, because as Hegel said, you can always integrate these thesis antithesis into a higher thesis. And I thought, well, what integrates objectivity and subjectivity? And I thought about it for a year, and I came up with art. Why art? Because art is an object. You know, the Mona Lisa is wood and paint, and you hang it on a tree in a forest, and you know, a squirrel can take it apart and build something out of it. So that's object that we all agree. But yet the art doesn't exist without the interpretation, without the human experience. Now you could say the same thing about the tree doesn't exist either. But at the same time, if I walk into that tree with my eyes closed, I'm going to get my head in a hit. So that's, I argue on those grounds, and I would argue that Plato, you know, the Platonic ideal, that Hegel with this idea that there's a structuring, implies a certain, while it might be impossible to view it directly, you can kind of, you know, get around it. It's like the shadow on the wall of the cave, and you step out, and I think Nietzsche, with his order of rank, would also argue of an objective, you know, some objective standard of which against which things are measured. So that's the type of arguments I've been addressing.
But can you take objectivity into ethics? Seems to be the key question. Are there some objective standards of good and evil such that presumably they are universal?
Mystics
so
would
really
argue yes, wouldn't they?
That's where people seem to have the most agitated
I would
arguments.
argue yes as well, and I would invoke the mystics, the mystical experience. There are, you know, we had the Judd last show reacted vehemently to some suggestion of good and evil in the world. It was like, but you know, I like the way you described it, is that evil is something that is a de-evolutionary force, that evolution is the thing that's, you know, that's the force that's driving consciousness. You know, consciousness relies on evolution to be what it is, and anything that breaks down or stands in the way of that evolutionary force is not good. You know, because really what the goal is, this evolution to perfection and divinity and whatever you want to describe that.
Isn't that pretty human-centric then?
No, it's conscious-centric. I would say that dolphins have consciousness, and it's conscious-centric. And to say, I don't believe humans, I believe cats, dogs have consciousness, humans have, whales have consciousness, that I believe actually, based on the size of their brain, is more evolved than ours. Their brains are more evolved. You know, whatever relationship there is to the brain, the gray matter, and especially the frontal lobes, the higher areas for higher reasoning, that I would say dolphins and whales are more evolved than we are, for that reason.
Differently evolved, let's say differently.
Okay.
More.
I'll take differently,
Differently
but
evolved, yeah.
but again, taking the objective standard, I'd say, well, what are
Well, I
they?
don't think there is an objective. Can I just come back to this objective standard? Because I don't think there is an objective standard. I think that, you know, everybody's in their own subjective morality, and people are in different states or modes of consciousness. And you mentioned the mystical experience. I don't think there's, you know, an ultimate mystical code of conduct. What there is, as people clarify their consciousness and get more in touch with the deeper being inside, what they discover is that their inner nature is actually a quality of love.
Right.
And that love then begins to affect their actions. And so you wouldn't find a mystic doing something that was going to deliberately, consciously harm another person. Because much more it would be a question of love would be to the forefront of their consciousness, and they would make decisions about what is the most loving thing I can do. So I think a true moral code arises out of a state of consciousness. If a person is caught up in a lot of fear and has had maybe, you know, a hugely troubled childhood and who knows what else going on in their life, they may still be trying to get by in life, but they may be doing things that, you know, consciously or unconsciously cause a great deal of suffering to other people. And we don't like that, I think rightly so. But I don't think there's an objective code.
Well, but it sounds, from what you were saying, I would say that is the objective code. The fact that, you know, that the mystics would be going toward love, going away from hate, going away from fear. That the fact that you could say this is love and this is hate, this is fear and this is courage.
What I'm saying is there isn't a code that says thou shalt do this or shalt not do that. There is a way of being being, which is how do I express what is the most loving thing I can do in this situation. So it's a principle of action rather than a code.
Right, a principle.
Yeah.
Don't you get cultures evolving over time so that the moral codes that are associated with those cultures are advancing over time as human beings' consciousness as a whole is getting higher and higher? So that you do sort of have a moral code. It's not fixed, so it's not really objective in that sense. But at any one given time, there's sort of a center of gravity of the culture you're in, and it will make an expression of its highest code. And that's sort of the agreed on.
But it's not always evolving. There
It's
are other
sometimes
times
de-evolving.
it's
Yeah.
evolving.
I'd say we're in
The
the
general
period of
trend has been
de-evolving
to
in general.
evolve, though.
Oh, we've kind of hit rock bottom.
You think we've hit rock bottom?
I think we're near
I mean, we
it.
don't
We're
have
near it.
slavery anymore. People aren't dying in their 20s.
Oh, we do have
No,
slavery. As a matter of
You
fact,
better believe we
slaves
do.
make a lot of the chocolate you eat.
Yeah.
You read the
Okay.
San Jose Mercury News.
No, I think something that Teilhard de Chardin, I believe it was Teilhard de Chardin, said that everything that rises converges.
Right.
And if you think about it, that's one way of thinking about, if you like, I don't like the term objectivity, but whatever it is that objectivity is referring to, that we sense, there is some set of ultimate truths that the more enlightened a being you are, the more you're going to converge on that truth that other people are also converging on.
Exactly.
So it's more like a convergence
Right.
and a kind of,
And then-
I would say, resonating together. Part of the problem with objectivity, I think, is that the term itself comes out of the Platonic epistemology that we inherited. And one way of thinking about that is to say that the core question of epistemology is what is there and how do we know? And when we know, then we say, and we rely mostly on science for that, well, that's truth. That is objective truth. And that seems to be the function of science, primarily to find out what there is and how it's structured and so forth. But that is sometimes referred to as a correspondence theory of truth, because whatever truth we have corresponds in some sense, whatever's in our head corresponds to what's, quote, out there. Well, that is not